Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and welcome to the first episode of a 4-part series I'm going to be doing that's going to serve as kind of a introductory system into Age of Sigmar. Because I know a lot of people have been coming to me with questions about it. You know, they're saying, can I play with the models I have? Is the lore worth getting into? Is the gameplay fun? Yada 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 yada. So I figured I would make a couple of videos to sort of give everyone some baby steps into the setting, the gameplay, and where your armies might fit into it, or maybe your favorite lore might fit into it. So let's go ahead and get started. The way this is going to work is that each episode kind of covers a different theme. So this episode I'm going to be talking about what happened to your favorite Warhammer Fantasy army. As in, if you play them on tabletop, where are they now? What factions have they turned into? If they've turned into any, can you still play with the models you own? Has anything you're playing with been retired? And, if you like their lore, who is like the closest faction that they've evolved into, so on and so forth. And, and maybe like little snippets of how they changed. So let's go ahead and get into it. First, I'm just going to go alphabetical order. That just makes life easy, right? So let's start with the Beastmen. So the Beastmen are one of the races that actually got a huge upgrade going into Age of Sigmar. The Beastmen were they were a race that was kind of left on the side of the road leading into the end times because they never got their 8th edition army book. I don't even remember if they got a 7th edition army book. I think they just had I don't remember anymore. But no, they did have a 7th edition. But, their army kind of fell behind in a lot of ways. And they were short on a lot of models. And they were super disorganized. And it was just messy and ugly. Well, the good news is if you're a Beastman player, transitioning into Age of Sigmar is going to be smooth as silk. Because they've only gotten upgraded. So if you pick up Beastmen, the new army you're going to be going into is just the Beasts of Chaos. And like many armies in Age of Sigmar, most armies in Age of Sigmar during 2nd edition, which is the edition we're in currently, whenever they get a new release, their faction is basically made up of 3 sub-factions with a little bit of extra goodies thrown in sometimes. So the Beasts of Chaos, for instance, are made up primarily of 3 factions. The Bray Herds, the War Herds, and the Thunderscorn. So the Bray Herds are your OG Beastmen that are not monstrous. So like Bestigors, Gors, Ungors, Chariots, Bray Shamans, Beast Lords, Kazrak, those kinds of characters. So all of the models you would have had are essentially playable or can be played as something. For instance, if you have like a Kazrak One-Eye model or a Morgr model or a Malagor model, those guys aren't around anymore. Obviously, they're all dead. But, well, Morgr not technically, but the other 2 are. And so, but you can use their models to play as, they have rules for their models as essentially like if you take Kazrak, you would just be taking a Beast Lord that just looks really cool. Or if you take Malagor, he would just be a great Bray Shaman that's really awesome. But they have like their own lores of magic now. You can dedicate them to whatever god you want. So they have a lot of really cool stuff going for them. And their lore is super detailed and intricate now. Like there's a whole cult dedicated to Morgr, because Morgr, after the Warhammer Fantasy world blew up, kind of stopped having a mortal avatar and transitioned back into being a god of primordial fury and mutation. And now he's worshipped as a god and has like a whole cult that you can play. So like each book basically has like a set of sub-factions in it. So not sub-factions as in species, but like, hey, you can build your army around this narrative theme, and if you do, you get a lot of like really powerful bonuses, but the restrictions to your army are very tight compared to normal. And one of them is like the spawn of Morgr. So you can literally be like, I love Morgr, I love Warhammer Fantasy Beastmen, so I'm gonna build my army around that. And you can actually run with that and get some really, I think they're called the Scions of the Gave spawn, which is one of the titles Morgr had. But that's a super cool one. Then you have the War Herd, which are your Minotaurs, your Cygors, and your Gorgons, and your Doombulls. So basically all the Minotaurs and Minotaur accessories. All the big stompy monsters that are similar to them. And they're basically just they have a lot of really badass rules about getting across the table super fast and just carving people up. Then last you have the Thunderscorn. And the Thunderscorn, if you couldn't guess, are the Dragon Ogres. So the Dragon Ogres and the Dragon Ogre Shaggots have their own sub-faction within the Beastmen. And the really cool thing about this is if you're a big fan of like Kolek Suneater, who never had an official model, but you can make Dragon Ogres Shaggots that were way stronger than the ones in Warhammer Fantasy. Because what you can do now is Dragon Ogre Shaggots are not only characters again, like they were in older editions of Fantasy, but they also are wizards.
You're a wizard, Kolek.
And they have their own lore. They have the lore of lightning, so you can hurl thunderbolts at your enemies with spells, or hit your own allies with thunderbolts to charge them with electricity. They're a very cool sub-faction, but that's what's happened to the Beastmen. So they've remained more or less the same, they just have more options now. And they even have a new sub-faction you can kind of build around too, because we'll talk about Tzeentch in a little bit, but when Tzeentch got his book released, they made the Zongors into like a whole model line. So there's like literally like 6 or 7 different types of units of Zongors. Like there are some that ride on discs of Tzeentch and have giant bows. There are some that have staves. There are some that have like these crazy swords, and you can take them as part of your Beasts of Chaos army with no, like they don't count as allies. They count as like a true part of your army, which is super cool. After that, we have Bretonnia. So Bretonnia is probably in the weirdest position of all of the old world world that was factions. Funny enough, one thing that the reason I was so excited to make this video is because one of the things that I learned while I was kind of snooping around and doing research, because I'm starting to get into competitive play, is that Games Workshop, much to everyone's surprise, has stayed very committed to updating the rules for Warhammer Fantasy model lines, because a lot of us had assumed during first edition that they were going to abandon them, because it kind of seemed like they were, because they kind of just stopped talking about it. But when second edition came out in I believe 2017, they revamped the rules, and they went back and looked at the Warhammer Fantasy models, and they not only gave them point values for all their models, but they completely reworked their rules from the ground up to make them actually good. Because I know for me personally, one of the things I hated about Age of Sigmar when it started was that all of the Warhammer Fantasy models that didn't have rules got new rules that were, pardon my French, but fucking obnoxious, and were a spit in the face to their players. You know, they had shit like, if you were a dwarf player, you would get like a bonus if you had the longest beard, or you had to do like really humiliating and annoying shit to use powerful abilities that were like broken, but they required you to do really stupid crap. Like if you're a Bretonnian player, you actually had to like hold up a drink and give a toast to get like a bonus on Grail Knights. They got rid of all that shit. So now if you go look at the new Bretonnian rules, which I'll throw up some here on the page, all these rules are free. You can just download them from Games Workshop directly, and you can, if you have a Bretonnian army, you can just pick up your Bretonnian army and go play. And even if you scroll down to the bottom of all these compendiums for the old world, and this is the case for all of the Warhammer Fantasy models that don't have like new rules. So like if you're like a Loserman player, obviously the Loserman have a Beastman player is probably, well, not a Beastman player is probably a better example. A Loserman player, most of all the Loserman models have new rules. They're Seraphon now. But like Tenenhuan, for instance, the special character, had a unique model, and he didn't get new rules, so he's basically, retired. However, they gave him an updated profile, and he's actually pretty powerful. So like if I want to take Tenenhuan with my Seraphon, they actually have rules and like substitution rules too, where they're like, okay, if you have a Tenenhuan model, he counts as this type of model, this is how many points it's worth, and he does count as a Seraphon, so you can take him in your Seraphon army, which is awesome. I'm so glad they did that. But anyway, so for Bretonnia, really there's not like a true inheritor of Bretonnian lore yet, or their aesthetic, I should say. So like if you want to play Bretonnian AOS, right now I'd probably recommend just stick with your Bretonnian models. You can't buy them from Games Workshop anymore, you can still get them off eBay and stuff, or use your own collection. But if you're looking for lore, there's 2 ways you can go about it. One is that the Flesh Eater courts, which are the ghouls, they're like the undead ghoul faction, their lore is kind of a dark, crazy version of Bretonnia lore, which I know sounds absolutely ridiculous, and it kind of is. And until I found out that the Bretonnians had updated rules, I used to get really mad about it. But now that I know the Bretonnians are still playable and have a full army roster that's viable, so that I get less upset about it now. But if you're like, man, if you're someone who liked Bretonnia because of how goofily evil and messed up they kind of were, like you like the whole dynamic of the super haughty and snooty knights who treated the peasants like less than trash, but they had like really, they were very noble, but kind of in a twisted way that medieval times tend to be, where you're like, they're heroes, kinda, then Flesh Eater Courts may be where you want to turn your attention, at least lore-wise. Obviously, they play entirely different than Bretonnia because they're all about monsters and infantry and swarms and dark magic, but the Flesh Eater Courts believe themselves to be Bretonnia, and I mean that literally. Like, all of their units are named after Bretonnian units when they go by their quote-unquote true names. They're completely crazy, but if you're like, man, I really like that kind of dystopian Bretonnia, and that's where I want to go with it, then I would suggest checking out the Flesh Eater Courts. Now, if you're like, no, I want the noble Bretonnia, I want the knights in shining armor, the heroes, the badasses, I want the Lewin Leoncurs, like all that stuff, then I believe that's coming, but they're not here yet. Because one thing that we'll kind of talk about in the third video, which is like where we are now, Age of Sigmar lore-wise, there are two realms we haven't really explored yet in Age of Sigmar, and that's the realm of light and the realm of shadow. And in the realm of light, one thing we know that's happening is that Tyrion who's one of the gods of light, has been riding around and basically gathering up a big crusade of knights, and apparently the realm of light is full of like virtuous knights. That's like one of the main demographics there. So although Tyrion is likely forging his own race of elves to go along with it, I would not be surprised if there is a knightly human faction that gets revealed in the realm of light, who are basically the inheritors of the true crown of Bretonnia. So until that day comes, you can either pick up like the Free Cities book, which is coming out, which Free Cities is basically just like all the old Warhammer Fantasy models that are in Age of Sigmar lore-wise. I don't really think they have a lot of knights, but they have a couple that you can kind of go with. Like, they have like the Dragon Princes and the Cold One Knights, who are still good guys, or they're good guys now, but but if you're waiting for like true Bretonnia, you probably have to wait into the future, but at the very least, you can always just like literally just Google AOS Bretonnia rules, and just get the one that when you scroll down to the bottom of a web page, which you'll see me showing it off here, has 2017 copyrighted at the bottom, and that's the legal one right now. Next is Chaos Dwarves. So Chaos Dwarves got a straight, like, they just moved straight to Age of Sigmar. They're called the Legion of Asgore now, and their rules are free. If you have Chaos Dwarves, or if you want to follow their lore, you just gotta go to the Forge World website and look at their like rules and compendiums, or check out their models. The Chaos Dwarves have not appeared in any lore stories yet, but Games Workshop is clearly paying attention to them because their rules were updated as recently as 2018. So they've been updated. They're pretty scary, and they're a fairly reasonably sized army compared to a lot of Age of Sigmar armies, because a lot of them have like less massive model lines, but to kind of fit the way the game functions better. So if you're looking to get into Chaos Dwarves, granted, I believe they are the most expensive army to collect because they're a Forge World army, but that's no different than it was in Warhammer Fantasy. So if you're a big Chaos Dwarf fan, they haven't really showed the Legion of Asgore and the Zar Dwarden, as they're called now, haven't really appeared in any notable stories yet, but I'm sure they will eventually. Next, we've got the Demons of Chaos. So for the Demons of Chaos, they were changed pretty fundamentally. Demons in Warhammer Fantasy, at least in the 8th edition, were really famous for being like together. You would take demons and all four gods kind of mixed together. They don't really do that anymore. What we have now is each one of the dark gods has their own army. So you have the Hedonites of Slaanesh, the Disciples of Tzeentch, the Blades of Khorne, and the Maggotkin of Nurgle. And basically, each of these guys has a full book with its own completely unique lore and focuses, and each one of them essentially has 3 sub-factions. And the sub-factions are basically all basically pure demons, pure mortals, and then like a mix. The one exception being Slaanesh. Slaanesh's book has more to do with like the theme of your army, like chariots and really, really fast stuff, slower infantry, and then like demons. Like it's mixed slightly differently because Slaanesh doesn't have a massive mortal line like all the other guys do. So, and even Tzeentch's is different too. Tzeentch has like a mortals line, a beastman line, and then a demons line, for instance. But in any event, so they're actually very simple now. All of them are crazy unique. You know, they have their own lores of magic, and they're way more fleshed out than they were in Warhammer Fantasy, and they have acquired some amazing models. Because no longer, if you're playing a God Force, no longer do you just pick up generic, like, demons. Well, not generic demons, but, like, you don't pick up generic Warriors of Chaos anymore and just, like, paint them green. You're like, oh, they're Nurgle now. No, now you get the Maggotkin, and if you want, like, mortals, you go and you pick up the Putrid Blight Kings, which are, like, these morbidly obese, grotesque Warriors of Chaos who are so bloated and fat, they've literally, like, bursted out of their plate mail, and they're super cool looking. So they got massive improvements for all of the God factions. But there are still undivided Warriors of Chaos, but of course we'll get to that later. But for demons are split up according to their gods. Most of the demon lines have received completely new models and been overhauled. All of the greater demons have been completely overhauled, and they look amazing. I will be genuinely upset if Creative Assembly does not use the Age of Sigmar greater demons. Because the Warhammer Fantasy greater demons look like crap in comparison. But, you know, that's how it goes. So, Dark Elves are next. If you're a Dark Elves player, you will go to one of two places. If you were really, really into Khaine and you loved, like, Witch Elves especially, they have their own complete book and faction, which are the Daughters of Khaine. And that's all about Morathi, who is the High Oracle of Khaine now, and like Witch Elves, and they got a ton of new models. So they have like the Bloodrack Medusa, and they've got like mini versions. They've got Harpies, and then they've basically got a lot of hybrids, so they like have Witch Elves who have been basically fused with Harpies, and then you got like the Bloodrack Medusa, but then you've got like Bloodrack Medusae that have been fused with Witch Elves, and then just tons of Witch Elves. I think Sisters of Slaughter are also in that army. And then Morathi, Cauldrons of Blood, all that stuff. So if that was what you really liked about the Dark Elves, you liked all the ladies, then you get to do Daughters of Khaine. Like, that's the army you'll be checking out lore-wise and picking up. And they have they're the only Realm of Shadow faction we have right now. So they know a lot of really cool and interesting secrets. And they're very mysterious but bloodthirsty. And they've got a whole bunch of sneakiness going on because of what Morathi's went up to. If you like the armored Dark Elves, or you like the fleets, all the pirates, or any of that stuff, then you're gonna want to collect the Free Cities book. So this is the first army where I'm really gonna get to go in depth about it. But the Free Cities book is about to come out, and it's the book that is the reason I've started making this series. And the Free Cities book is basically a complete update to all of the Warhammer Fantasy faction models that were just sitting around, who were like relevant in Age of Sigmar but didn't have a book. So we didn't have like updated lore about them, and we didn't know what they were doing, and that, you know, they just kind of had like a page, like you would get a book that was just like, here are rules, and that was it, and it was boring. Now they're getting a legit army book, so you can pick up the Free Cities book if you're into like the old school Dark Elves, because they have all of the old Dark Elf models. So they have all their monsters, so if you like Hydras and Manticores, you can pick those up. If you're just wanting to get, or the Charybdis, you know, if you're just wanting to collect all the different infantry, or you want all the like Scourge, or the pirates, the Corsairs, they have their own faction. They're called like Scourge. I think they're called Scourge Privateers now. So they're pirates, and they're kind of good guys, but not really. They're still slavers and monster hunters. And they're, you know, kind of spooky. So the Dark Elves are still... one thing that's important to note for the Dark Elves is that they are an Order faction, both the Daughters of Khaine and all of the other Dark Elves. But just because they are Order does not mean they are good. There are a lot of bad guys in Order. And Order is kind of this nebulous thing where there's a lot, like, Order is basically full of everybody who just wants to create civilization that's forced to work together because the other 3 factions are trying to kill them. So there you go. But if you're into Dark Elves, all of them, pretty much all of the models are 100% playable and have really cool rules, and they have some of their special characters are back. There are a few that are still missing, like Malekith, who is now called Malarian. He has not revealed his unique faction yet, and we have no idea what they're going to be like. We know they're from the Realm of Shadows. Some people say they're going to be like shadow demons. Other people say they're going to be like dragon elf hybrids. Who knows? So that's a faction we're waiting to come out. But for classic Dark Elves, you want free cities. If you want to go a little more wild with it and you like all the half-naked ladies or 90% naked ladies, then you want Daughters of Cain. Next on the list, we have Dwarves. So Dwarves had a pretty serious overhaul going into Age of Sigmar. They have been split up into 3 different books. If you really, really like Slayers were the only thing you cared about, or you really like, you want to have like essentially what's an Anvil of Doom, then you're going to want to go Fire Slayers. Fire Slayers are basically a pure Slayer faction that takes it to a crazy extreme. So they all look like Slayers, but they have all these crazy rules about how they basically forge fragments of Grimnir into their own flesh to make their skin like, you know, harder than Gromril, or make themselves incredibly powerful. They've got crazy berserkers, they've got axe throwers, they've got guys with like magma cannons that they like, you know, hold and shoot at you. And they also have monsters. They've got the magma droths, which are these huge salamanders that are the size of dragons that they ride on, or sometimes they just have feral ones joining them. And they're a very, very cool faction, and they got a update earlier this year. And in that update, they actually got like a forge that allows their rune smiters to essentially use these really powerful runes on the battlefield, instead of, you know, because they don't have magic because they're dwarves. And that system is super duper cool. So if like you really like rune magic and want to explore that, or you just love Slayers and their aesthetic, or you just wanted your dwarves to always have monsters, then you want to go Fire Slayers. If you want to go a really weird direction with it, or if you really liked gyrocopters and gyrobombers and were like, man, I wish these had a whole faction, then you might check out the Caradron Overlords. The Caradron Overlords are essentially the steampunk faction. They're very steampunk. They're the steampunk faction of all Age of Sigmar. No one else has an aesthetic like them. You know, they were like full nautical diving suits, and like because they're dwarves, they're very ornate, and like their face masks have like carved beards and crazy stuff, and they're all about money, and they're traders who are basically, they fly around and they're all about like following a really strict merchant code. They're not really pirates. They're kind of like a really well organized trade company that can be incredibly violent. But they use really bizarre guns. You know, they use like steam powered guns, or guns that fire compressed air at you, where like it's so compressed and it fires so fast that it'll just like literally blow your head off. Because I don't know if you've ever messed with compressed air, but it's kind of terrifying. And they have like these massive flying ships. I was literally at the Citadel the other day, and because I had never seen it in person, but I saw one of their frigates in person, which is like their largest ship, and it's literally the size or slightly larger than a Stegodon. Like, it's bigger than a Stegodon, and it's like around the size of a Greater Demon. But these like are huge ships, and you can like dock all of your guys on the ships, and they like fly around and they jump out and they start shooting at people. And they have like war machines mounted on their ships. So if you're super into like crazy technology and you've always wanted your dwarves to be really advanced, or maybe you like kind of a nautical theme, or you really like a steampunk theme, then you want to go with the Caradron Overlords. They're very different from the dwarves of Warhammer. They're probably the most exotic. Then, if you're sitting there tapping your fingers going, oh god, he hasn't mentioned like classic dwarves. If you want classic dwarves, then one of the things I'm super excited for is the new Free Cities book. The new Free Cities book allows you to just have a pure old good old-fashioned dwarf army. You get hammerers, iron breakers, iron drakes, longbeards. Belagar's model is basically like a generic dwarf king. You can have rune lords, well, not rune lords, but like rune smiths, who have a really interesting way that they interact with your models. They basically provide like super crazy buffs. A lot of the dwarf line was kind of retired or moved into different forms. So like the Anvil of Doom got moved into the Fire Slayers and is now a Anvil of Doom on top of a giant monster. Or like if you like Thorgrim Grudgebearer, he kind of got transformed to some other stuff. But if you like classic dwarves, then you want to go Dispossessed, which means you want to pick up the Free Cities book and read all of that lore so you can find out what all the dwarves have been up to for the Dispossessed, which are your classic dwarves. And then Ironweld Arsenal, which is all the dwarf war machines and machines. So like gyrocopters, gyrobombers, cannons, organ guns, engineers, those are Ironweld Arsenal. All your dwarf warriors who wear super heavy plate, those are Dispossessed. If you want to just go crazy with it, you got Caradron Overlords. And if you want Slayers galore with monsters and fire and crap, then you want Fire Slayers. And if you're really interested in like Gotrek, you can run, I think, as a Dispossessed with the Free Cities, or you can run him as a Fire Slayer because he's basically turning into the new God of Fire. So that's it for dwarfs. Moving on to Empire. Empire is super straightforward. If you want to play Empire, you pick up Free Cities. Period, end of story. Some of the Empire models have been retired, but those Empire models that have been retired, you can easily pick up the Empire Compendium from the website, which gives you updated rules for all of the models that aren't being continued. For instance, the Empire Great Cannon was discontinued, or like Balthazar Gelt. Balthazar's Gelt model was discontinued, but if you have Balthazar Gelt, it gives you competitive rules for him with points and competitive rules and all that crazy stuff, and they do that with all of the Empire models that have been retired. And when I talk about the models that have been retired, they even give rules for some of the really old models. Just an example off the top of my head, Ariel had a model back in 5th edition, which is a really long time ago for the Wood Elves. They gave Ariel's model rules, so you can run her in Age of Sigmar, despite the fact that she's like 15 years old or something like that. They didn't have to do that. They could have just done 8th edition. So pretty much if you have a model from a Warhammer Fantasy collection, it probably has rules in AOS that are competitive with points. But yeah, so Empire, you'll pick up Free Cities. That's 99% of the range. If you have something that's not included in that somehow, I can't remember exactly which models aren't included, but I think like Huntsman got retired. So if you have Huntsman, you can check out the Empire Compendium to get their new rules. High Elves, exact same thing. All of the High Elves have been recycled into Free Cities. And now, when you're looking at High Elves, if you when it comes to Elves, the other new Elf faction worth talking about is at least for the High Elves, because they're inspired by the High Elves, are the Ideneth Deepkin. So basically, if you took the High Elves and you really fucked them up, like if you took the High Elves and basically forced them through a Cthulhu-esque experience where they go crazy and kind of turn kind of sadistic and just trying to survive in some horrible, nasty situations, and their lore, and you made the High Elf lore genuinely super dark, depressing, and kind of fucked up in my opinion, where like children are being tortured, or people are having their souls ripped out of them, or giant sea monsters are being beaten until they're forced to obey, like super upsettingly, if you really are fond of sea life, you will not like the Ideneth Deepkin lore. You will like their models. But the Ideneth Deepkin are all about this. They're basically sea elves, but they're elves that live underneath the ocean. And they have they ride on giant sharks, and they ride on giant electric eels, and they have giant turtle monsters and all of them can fly through the air because they can float on the winds of magic as if it were the sea in certain circumstances, to dumb it down. So if you're like, man, I would love to have high elves who are basically borderline super evil, not because they want to be evil, but because they have to be just to survive, and it's all really dark and kind of messed up, then check out the Ideneth Deepkin. Or if you just really like sea creatures, then the Ideneth Deepkin are for you. If you want classic high elves that are very noble and have knights and dragons and phoenixes and phoenix guard and all that stuff, then you want the Free Cities book. It's literally got all the old high elves. Next is the Loserman. Loserman, super easy. Loserman, you go Seraphon. I will note, if you're wanting to get into the hobby, don't get into Seraphon right now. Wait a little bit. Their book is super old, and they're about to get a new one. I don't know when, but soon, hopefully, because I've been waiting on that book. So if you're wanting to get into the hobby right now, you can start collecting Loserman models. Just don't buy the book, because I'm fairly certain they're getting a heavily retconned second edition book soon. But Loserman is literally like you go straight to Seraphon. Like there are no alternate pathways. You walk into a room where like you go straight to the back. You get to cut in front of the line. Just go right there. Ogre Kingdoms. Ogre Kingdoms are also, they're kind of in the same place as the Losermen, where you can collect the model range, but don't buy any books, because they're also about to get a huge update. We've had it teased, and they've shown little snippets of new Ogre models that are coming out, which look awesome, but their new book isn't going to be out for a little bit. We know that there's an Ogre book coming out that's going to be the entire Ogre model range in one book. If you're just desperate and you're like, I have to play Ogres, all of the mounted ogres, so like the not the Rhinox riders, whatever the modern version that's called, the Mournfang riders, the Thunder Tusk, the Stonehorns, those guys all have rules and a book, which is called the Beastclaw Raiders. But their second edition book is going to be combining all the ogres into one book, whereas the Beastclaw Raiders are literally just the ogres that have mounts, which is a pretty small model line. So I'm very excited for their new book. I would recommend waiting until that comes out before you pick up any books, but feel free to go ahead and get any models you want. As far as their lore goes, the ogres have gotten pretty interesting. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention for like the Loserman, the Seraphon are fascinating lore. I don't want to get super into it because from what I understand, there's a significant retcon coming to their lore in second edition when their new book comes out, so I don't really think it's worth discussing their lore. Ogres, the Beastclaw Raiders, are basic. Instead of being not tortured but corrupted by the Great Maw like they were in Warhammer Fantasy, where they're eternally hungry, basically the forces of destruction, so like ogres, greenskins, those guys, each one of them has like their own private god, which is basically a facet of Gorka Morka. Because where most gods like outright create an avatar, Gorka Morka basically either punched something, bit something, or kicked something to the extent that it like gained a significant part of his divine essence and became sentient and is like a primordial god of anger most of the time. And in the case of the Beastclaw Raiders, they're pursued by the Everwinter, which is literally like an eternal winter that is always chasing them and kind of trying to devour them. And it's really kind of terrifying if you think about it. But they use it to their advantage, and they always stay ahead of it, which kind of makes a fascinating idea for their army. But they're going to be getting an update with the regular ogres, so yeah, wait on that. Greenskins are next. So Greenskins had probably one of the most fun upgrades. The Greenskins were split into two different books. Well, a couple different books, but they just got reunified. So the first, which a friend of mine just started collecting, are the Gloomspite Gits. And the Gloomspite Gits are all things goblin under the sun. So your Gloomspite Gits have three sub-factions that make them up. You have the Forest Goblins, or which they're called Grots now. Or you have the Spider-Fang Grots, who are the old school Forest Goblins. So your regular goblins, giant spider riders, Ragnarok spiders, etc. Then you have, which there's literally rules where you can take like multiple Arachnaroks and you can deploy them as like ambushers, which is terrifying. Then you have the Moon Clan Grots, which are basically night goblins, and they're kind of like the main characters. The other two sub-factions kind of support them, but you can run pure Forest Goblin if you want. Moon Clan Grots, of course, got the new character Skragrot the Loon King, who is a really, really fun, interesting character. They just had a massive novel released about their faction, and Skragrot, who is basically Skarsnik, he's the new Skarsnik. So there's like a ton of really awesome lore there, and Moon Clan is all of your night goblins and your squigs. And then last, but certainly not least, are the Trogoths, which are the trolls. So if you like trolls, you can build a pure troll army. And they even have giant-sized trolls, which are called, I think they're called Dank something Trogoths. But they're like huge. And they're really goofy looking. All the new trolls, because they have like mushrooms growing out of them, and they like sleep in caves for really long times. They're super goofy looking, in a good way. Like they're very funny. But you can go pure trolls, you can go pure night goblins, pure forest goblins, or you could just take a mix, and that's Gloomspite, and they're very, very fun from what I understand. Then you have there's a brand new book coming out the same week as the same day as the Free Cities book. We're getting the Ogre Clans book, and the Ogre Clans are just orcs. If you like orcs, that's your book. They're also split into 3 subfactions. You have the Iron Jaws, which you have the Iron Jaws, the Bone Splitters, and the Big Wa. And the Big Wa is just the other 2 combined with like some special stuff. Bone Splitters are just pure savage orcs. So like all orcs that don't like to wear clothes, Bone Splitters. Orcs that do like to wear clothes, Iron Jaws. That's it. Iron Jaws. There's not really any. Although I believe there are rules for them. There's not a lot of middling orcs anymore, like orcs that wear leather and are kind of like halfway between black orcs and bones and savage orcs. There's like an entire faction made up of orcs wearing crazily heavy armor, and then there's an entire faction of naked orcs, and then the 2 of them can join together for the Big Wa. But they got a ton of really cool lore and amazing models. The Iron Jaws in particular got the new wyverns, so instead of like the skinny half dragons that wyverns were, they have what are called maw crushers, which look like if A, wyverns grew arms, but B, like beefed up on so many steroids to the point that they can't fly anymore because they're just so buff. Like, you know, very orky. But if you like orcs, you basically just pick between those. It's like, did you like savage orcs? Great. Or if you like monster hunting, great. Go Bone Splitters. If you're like, no, I want a classic WoW with all the orcs wearing the heavy armor and axes and bashing people and stuff, then go Iron Jaws. They both have their own wizards. They're both super fun in their own ways. Skaven are still Skaven. You can just pick up the Skaven book. It's straight 1-to-1. Skaven book is split up into 5 subfactions, which are basically 6 subfactions rather, sort of, which are basically the clans. So you still have Clan Eshin, Clan Scryers, Clan Molder, Clan Pestilence, and then you have Master Clan, which are the Grayseers, and then the Warlord clans. And you can kind of build based on whichever one you want, but they have a massive book. It's very fun, but it's a massive book. Their lore has changed pretty significantly, but they still have Thankful and Bone Ripper, so that's fun. But yeah, you can check out that book. And they still have Lord. Oh god, I forget what his name is. The Vermin Lord special character from the End Times. If you really liked him, he's still around too. So yeah, Skaven are pretty much the same. Not a lot's changed there. You just pick up the Skaven book. Tomb Kings. Tomb Kings are in a super interesting position. So Tomb Kings, if you own a Tomb King army, you can just Google AOS Tomb Kings rules, and they have a 2017 update where they have very competitive rules, really fun. They're not like goofy. They're like really serious, really well-made rules for their entire model range, and they have points and all that other stuff. They're really well designed. So if you want to just run your classic Tomb Kings, you can do that. That's fine. Even if you're running just a Death army, you can take your Tomb King army or your Tomb King models, I think, as allies, or you can just run as like a Death Alliance army and take Tomb Kings in it. That being said, if you're wanting to like get into Age of Sigmar lore wise, and you're like, okay, I understand the Tomb Kings are pretty much gone. Where do I go now? The great news is that the inheritors of the Tomb King aesthetic have been announced, which are the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. You can see most of their model line. They haven't revealed all their models, but many of them, and snippets of their lore, and they're very, very interesting looking. They're basically the Tomb Kings, except for the entire army are constructs instead of like just Ushabti, and instead of it just being like the Hyro Titans, the War Sphinx, the Necro Sphinx, and the Ushabti. The entire army are constructs, though many of them are bone-like in design, but they're crazy. They have all sorts of aesthetics from like Greece or Eastern Europe or the Middle East or Hinduism. Like they have crazy aesthetic. There's like a samurai-looking guy. There are dudes with like different, and they're like constructed from multiple souls to make the bodies, and they're very, very cool lore. They have war machines instead of instead of the catapults, though. They have like full-on trebuchets now, and their version of the Ushabti, instead of just being kind of like, instead of like having just Ushabti, they have like giant monstrous horse creatures with Ushabti heads, so they're a cavalry unit. And then they have these massive, super bulky looking Ushabti, and their backs are like massive rib cages, which are just filled with corpses, and they're crazy looking. But if you're looking for Tomb King aesthetic, then you want to go Ossiarch Bone Reapers when they come out. Next then is the Vampire Counts. Vampire Counts are pretty much still around in their full glory. They've just been split up into 3 sub-factions, which are if you just want like spirits, which is what I ended up going in Age of Sigmar next to my Seraphon. If you just want like, man, I wish I had an entire army of Banshees and Cairn Wraiths. Good news, that's a thing. And Spiritos, and the Black Coach. Then you go Night Haunts. Night Haunts are a pure spooky ghost faction, and they have tons of models that are super crazy awesome looking, and that's what I'm painting right now. If you're like, man, I really liked ghouls, and I really like the Ghoul Kings and the Strigoi, they have their complete own faction, which are the Flesh Eater Courts, so you can go that way. And pretty much, if there's anything else you liked about the vampires, like you're like, man, I like skeletons, or wights, or vampires, or anything under that category at all, then, or necromancers, then you want to go Legions of Nagash. Legions of Nagash is like a massive book that has a ton of sub-factions in it. You know, it's got like vampires, skeletons, zombies, necromancers, yada yada. So, for most Vampire Count players, if you're wanting to go like what was the main focus of Vampire Counts, you're going to want to go Legions of Nagash. If you specifically want to go Spooky Ghosts, you go Night Haunts. If you want to go pure Strigoi or Ghouls or any of that, you want to go Flesh Eater Courts. Warriors of Chaos. So Warriors of Chaos, a decent amount of their models were retired, but not as many as you may think. Most of their models were recycled into a new faction called the Slaves to Darkness. And Slaves to Darkness are literally just classic Warriors of Chaos. So like Chaos Warriors, Chosen, Chaos Knights, Chaos Chariots, all that stuff. Basically anything that was not devoted to a specific god is Slaves to Darkness. Which to run Slaves to Darkness, they don't really have a lot of really good lore right now because they're part of what's called the Grand Alliance Chaos book, which is like this huge book that has rules for all the Chaos models. So like Skaven, Warriors of Chaos, Demons, that's where you get the Slaves to Darkness rules from. But it's heavily believed that they have a new book coming out soon, because there is a faction that it's about Archaon called the Everchosen. And that book has 3 different kinds of models in it. It has Archaon, his Varangard, which are his core, and his super... They're basically Chaos Knights on such incredible steroids, I can't put it into English. And then the Gaunt Summoners, which are these crazy, powerful, borderline special characters who are demons of Tzeentch, but there's only 9 of them in existence, and they're like Archaon's personal slaves, because they're really powerful wizards, and he shackled them to his will. So if you wanna basically are like, if you're like, man, I fucking love the sound of Archaon, he rides a 3-headed dragon now, he has one of the coolest looking models in the game now, and you're like, man, I just want Archaon, and to build around him, you go Everchosen. If you're kind of like, no, I kind of want like classic Warriors of Chaos, like I want to use the old Warrior of Chaos models, or I want to build like that Slaves to Darkness thing sounds cool, but I want like a big army for it, I'd wait a little bit, because basically they've been releasing a massive model line for this new faction called the Dark Oath, which the Dark Oath faction are basically Norska. You know, they're all the people wearing animalistic furs, or they don't have anything on, you know, they barely have anything on at all. That's essentially the Dark Oath, but it looks like they're going to be combining them probably into one book that's either going to be the Slaves to Darkness book or like the Warriors of Chaos book or the Everchosen. I don't know what they're going to call it, but it seems like the Dark Oath, the Slaves to Darkness, and the Everchosen are going to probably combine into one big book in the near future. Then last but not least, the Wood Elves. So the Wood Elves are split into 2 different books now. If you liked the actual Wood Elves, so like the people who had skin and pointy ears, then you want to go Free Cities, because the Free Cities book has all their new lore and all of their new rules. So all the rules for your pointy-eared guys, they're called Wanderers now. But if that's what you really want to go into, you want to go Free Cities. If you like the tree spirits, so you like Durthu, Drycha, you know, treekin, tree men, all that stuff. They got a massive overhaul and got a whole new faction to themselves, which are called the Sylvaneth, which are a very, very cool faction. So kind of like how the Night Haunts I was telling you about were originally just like the Karen race, the Black Coach, the Banshee, and the Spirit Host, but they got expanded into a full model range. That's amazing. They did the same thing with the Sylvaneth. They took the treekin got retired because their models were trash, to be honest. They were super ugly and old. But they took the Treemen and the Dryads and were like, what if we made an entire faction based on these models? And they did. They look amazing. So if you're like, I want to be all about them tree spirits and Alariel, then you go Sylvaneth. If you're like, I want to be all about them elves, then you go Free Cities. But the cool thing about the Free Cities book that I kind of neglected to mention up to this point is the Free Cities book can team up with a lot of other armies without it being like allies, so it just counts as a fully functioning army. So like if you want classic Wood Elves, you could take the Free Cities book and the Sylvaneth book, and you in the Free Cities book they have specific rules where you can run Wanderers and Sylvaneth teamed up together, so you can have classic Wood Elves just with a larger model range. Same thing for if you own Caradron Overlords. If you have the Free Cities book and the Caradron's Overlord book, you can take classic Dwarves backed up by the Caradron Overlords or the Fire Slayers. So you can, like, if you're like, man, I'm a Dwarf player and I love the sound of, like, I really like those giant cool ships the Caradron Overlords have. I love the giant salamanders or all the Slayer models the Fire Slayers have. And but I really like the old dispossessed or the old dwarf like hammers and cannons and stuff. Well, you can run all three of those together thanks to the Free Cities book. So it's a really important, awesome book. But yeah, so that's gonna conclude all the factions. That's all 16 factions from Warhammer Fantasy covered. So if you have any questions, feel free to tweet them to me at LSotek, LSOTEK on Twitter. I'm trying to use that more often. Or you could just kind of leave a comment down in the description, in the comment section below. I'm hoping to kind of turn the 4th video of the series into kind of like a Q&A, catch anything I missed situation. Next video is going to be basically how we got from the end times to Age of Sigmar. 3rd video in this series is going to be how we got from the start of the Age of Sigmar to where we are now. And then the 4th one will hopefully be like kind of a Q&A. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. Yeah. Excited to know what you guys think. See you guys next time. Thanks for watching.